Hi, everybody. This is Dimitris Kairidis. I'm a professor of international politics in Athens and a member of the Greek Parliament, but I'm here in my capacity as the founding director of the Navarino Network, the co-organizer of our today's session. This is the second meeting of the 9th International Symposium on World Affairs of Thessaloniki, a meeting that has been going on since 2012. This is the 9th year, organized by the Cultural Society of Entrepreneurs of Northern Greece in Thessaloniki, with the great support, and we are very, very thankful, of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Athens and Cyprus office. We had our opening session a week ago, Monday, the 30th of November, and today, December the 7th, we have our second. We will have two more sessions to go until December 21st. This is an online event because of the COVID pandemic. We were not able to meet as usual in Thessaloniki for a whole day, but we are meeting on a weekly basis every Monday now. This is the second Monday at 8:30 sharp Greek time. Last time we talked about international affairs and how they have been affected by COVID. Today, we will turn our attention to the economy, one of the greatest victims of the pandemic. We had shock waves in the European, in the global economy, global recession because of the lockdowns. And this will be the topic of our session this evening, global recession and the Greek economy. And we have invited two very prominent economists who have written extensively. They are not isolated in the ivory tower, but are part and parcel of the policy-making debate. The first is an old acquaintance, Daniel Gros, from Brussels. He's the General Director of the Center for European Policy Studies, a guy who we have tried to bring to Thessaloniki many times, and somehow he has always managed to escape. But this time he had no excuse, since teleconferencing provides for easier contact. Now, Daniel is obviously a very prominent economist. He's a member of the board of Distinguished Fellow and the Distinguished Fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies, one of the most preeminent policy institutes in Brussels. He joined CEPS in '86 and has been the director of CEPS since 2000. Prior to joining CEPS, he worked at the IMF and the European Commission. He has published extensively, including on Greece, and he became quite a public persona during the recent Greek crisis. You can find all the details of the bios of our speakers on our website, www.thessalonikiSymposium.org. And I don't want to go further into detail. I will only say that I first met Daniel back in the spring of 2008, in those happy days before the crisis. And I was quite shocked after our first meeting, because he was the first guy to warn me very, very forcefully about the dangers coming and engulfing the Greek economy. He proved right, because a year and a half later, Greece went into its debt crisis, and took it almost a decade to try to find a balance again. Now, Nikos Vettas, our second speaker, is the Greek panelist in our panel. He is a very, very eminent economist who studied first in the US, the University of Pennsylvania. He is the General Director of the Foundation for Economic and Industrial Research, EOVE, since 2013, and also a professor at the Athens University of Economics and Business since 2003. He has served as the chairman of the economics department there and a member of the university council. He has published extensively, and more recently, he has been involved in the drafting of a very thorough policy paper on economic reforms for Greece, headed by the Nobel Prize winner economist, Mr. Pissarides. Nikos and Daniel, thank you very much for joining us and for being with us in this event. You viewers can watch us through various channels, both the sites of Navarino Network, the Thessaloniki Symposium, the Cultural Society, and the Adenauer Stiftung, and through the Facebook channels. You can go down and choose which link you want, either the English version, which is the original, the working language of our meeting, or if you prefer, there is simultaneous translation into Greek. You can click the button Greek and you will hear us translated in real time into Greek. So this is my introduction, and I will pass now the floor to our speaker, starting with Daniel Gros first. Daniel, the floor is yours to give us an overview of where we stand economically on the European level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for this very nice introduction. And as you noticed, I'm glad finally to be able to join your symposium, about which I had heard so much over these years. You asked me to talk about the economic landscape for Europe. I think when one does it now, today, when we're still in the midst of the crisis, one should not forget also the political environment, because the COVID crisis represented both a political and a deep economical, deep challenge for the economy. And I would summarize my point of view as in the following way, that Europe has faced the political challenge quite well, but I'm afraid that it is not doing very well on the economic front. Let me explain these two aspects in a few words. The political crisis is obvious. We had it in the spring, when at the beginning, at least, there was the impression that the crisis would hit everybody, but every member country was reacting in its own way, sometimes even closing the borders, not willing to share medical equipment with its neighbors. And there was no sign of any solidarity among member countries. And unfortunately, that has changed. Not only have the border closures being made more reasonable and limited to what is really strictly necessary from a medical point of view, but more importantly, a way was found to express solidarity, European solidarity, to those countries which were either hardest hit by the crisis or those which were least able to withstand the crisis. Of course, the crisis is still ongoing. We don't know how the second wave will go, how much it will impact the economies, especially of countries like Greece, which depend a lot on tourism. But the key step which was achieved in July was this agreement in the European Council to create what's called the Next Generation EU Fund. That was, I think, a landmark in the story of European integration, and it was politically a big step forward. Basically, Germany agreed to cross two red lines. The first red line was that there shouldn't be a transfer union in Europe, or at least in the euro area. And the country, Germany, agreed explicitly to transfers, which I personally think makes sense in this particular juncture. The key issue to be needed was transfers, not additional loans, like during the Greek crisis and the other crisis, financial crisis. And the second point, that Germany agreed to issuance of common debt. Again, I think this was entirely justified in this particular crisis. So that's the first part of my view. Politically, Europe has reacted quite well, and a big step towards a European integration was taken. Now, the second question is, how will Europe come out of this crisis economically? And here, I'm less optimistic. The COVID crisis had, of course, two elements. One, it's a temporary shock, because some things cannot be done today, but they might be done again tomorrow, like travel, tourism. Hopefully, sometime down the road, things will recover. But there's also another aspect of COVID, which is an accelerator of deep structural change towards digital ways in the economy, in services. And that is an aspect which, in my view, is not given sufficient attention in Europe. The reaction in most countries has been to adopt what's called short-term working measures. Because the idea was people cannot work for a certain time, but then we will come back to the status quo ante. And in the meantime, the government pays either enterprises or people when they work less. The implicit idea was a short temporary shock and we come back to the status quo ante. My point of view would be that to a large measure, we will not come back to the status quo ante. There will have been acceleration of change in many areas of the economy. And unfortunately, in Europe, we are not allowing that to happen. We keep people in their jobs, we protect jobs instead of protecting people. In the United States, we have seen something completely different. There were very generous transfers to people, to everybody basically. 30 million people were fired and 20 million were already rehired. So an enormous turnover in the labor market, an enormous process of adjustment. And that is the challenge we are facing. For the time being, we're just trying to get over this crisis, saying, okay, once we come back to normal, then things can work again. And my challenge is to policymakers to see that we will not come back to the same normal as before. The new normal will be different, and I think we should prepare for it right now already. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Now, Nico, I keep two words, two phrases that Daniel mentioned, countries that are least able or hardest hit by the pandemic. It seems to me he describes Greece, least able and hardest hit, a lethal combination for a country that is coming out of a traumatic, long economic crisis and was hit, especially this summer, with the collapse of tourism. So the question is, where do we stand? How is Greece faring economically in this pandemic?
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you, Dimitri, for the invitation. Let me pick up perhaps from where Daniel left it. It's a little bit too early to tell what's going to happen in the European economy and certainly what's going to happen in the Greek economy. We have to see, and a lot is going to be determined by decisions, by policy decisions to be made in the next few months that are going to be very crucial. For Greece, there are three question marks, all important. One is the direction for production and jobs. The second is how fast you can improve the efficiency of the state. Third, and this is both an internal, but it has a European dimension, is what's going to happen with expectations. And I'm going to explain what I mean with expectations. Perhaps if there was one thing that went wrong in the last 10 years of the crisis, was that the expectations were completely derailed. The whole country, not just the economy, was going through weeks and months and years without knowing where it was going. And so far, it seems that the expectations are a lot more stable, and that's going to be very important for the day after. In other words, there isn't this massive uncertainty hanging over everybody's head, and we shouldn't get into that. Now, if I can summarize, I hope I'm not in an unfair manner what Daniel said. Basically, he said for Europe, in terms of politics, we managed to avoid big mistakes. It would be like a huge mistake to add to the COVID crisis, to the pandemic, uncertainty about the stability of the Eurozone. There were those who were saying that once, not just the Eurozone, but the EU, once it is hit by a crisis like that, it is institutionally weak, and it's not going to tolerate this hit. Now, this proved not to be right. But at the same time, there was the second thing that basically says that Europe, especially when we compare it with a lot of the Asian economies and the US, is a lot less flexible in its labor markets, but primarily in its product markets. And so now that there is the challenge, but it's also an opportunity, it's going to take us a lot longer to grasp this opportunity, and perhaps we're going to miss the opportunity. Now, by making an analogy, I would say the same two issues apply for Greece. The system actually proved to be stable enough. The Greek public sector also responded, I wouldn't say extremely well, but adequately. Businesses certainly adapted well. So I would say overall, I would put strong marks when it comes to how resilient the system was. On the other hand, Greece, if there is one country that is kind of a closed system and not very conducive to change and innovation, that's Greece. And unless we pick up the pace for how we open up things for markets and the public sector, my worry is that when the big push in the global markets come, because it will come, the central scenario is that, this is not the end of the world. Sooner or later, we are going to see a big jump upwards for global demand. We should be there as a Greek economy, and we should actually bargain for a much better position in the global division of labor than previously. But for that to happen, we have to have a different way that the economy is functioning. When I say the economy, is not just money. The economy is the set of rules according to which people and businesses and the public sector interact. So let me end there, these first remarks, basically saying that it's a very interesting juncture where an economy that has shrunk by a cumulative 25% during what's I guess is now called globally the Greek crisis, and now another 10% this year, but has not collapsed. How we can get into growth that is not going to be only strong but sustainable.
Thank you, Nico. We come now to the more interactive part, and obviously you can comment on each other, so it's not just me posing questions. Let me start with Daniel here in a very kind of introductory way, step-by-step kind of way. Daniel, which countries of Europe, of the EU, are doing better and why, and which are the least capable of facing this pandemic? I mean, what is the landscape there first?
I mean, there are several aspects to be able to deal with the pandemic. The one aspect is just how much debt you inherit from the past. If you're like Germany or Holland, you start with a very low debt level. now your finance minister can splurge, right? The sky is the limit. They can distribute money left and right, and there's no problem. And of course, a country like Italy or Greece, which already has a very high debt burden, cannot do that. And that's, by the way, also the reason why I think it was good to have transfers, right, to those countries, because they couldn't take on more debt. That wouldn't have made sense. And then there is the question whether you can, because fighting the pandemic requires not just decisions at the top, we decide this, but has to be implemented at the bottom. So you need a very efficient administration below. As Vettas just said, I mean, in Greece, one would have expected the Greek administration not to perform very well, but it has done a pretty good job. And now in Europe, it's basically North and Northwestern Europe, which has a pretty good administration, and there the economic cost and also human cost to a certain extent has been much less. So Germany and the Scandinavians. And of course, also these are countries where tourism doesn't play a big role. And all of Southern Europe started with high debt, high importance of tourism, and to a varying degree with a less performing administration. But let me add one thing. In this pandemic, we have seen that even the best meaning governments don't always achieve what they want. So there is a large element of unpredictability in there, of chance. And therefore, I wouldn't say this country does better. It's all because it just took great decisions. There's an element of chance and luck.
Let me insist on 2 points you mentioned before I pass to Nikos. The first is the public debt. How big of an issue will be in the post-COVID era? Are you worried that public debt will balloon? Should we continue being Keynesian? You said it's good to spend, but then you hinted that the sky is the limit is not the right approach, or I might be wrong, I don't know. But what about the fiscal burden after the pandemic?
Okay, before I start, let me perhaps say something which is very important, in my view, for finance ministers to realize. Because when you said we are all Keynesians, we should not think of supporting demand, aggregate demand, through fiscal policy right now. Because this is a different recession. This is a sectoral recession. Let's take Germany. There's no point in providing people with lots of money so that they can go out and spend. They cannot go to restaurants, right? That part of the economy will not go up. What you can do is, as a strong government, you can give the restaurant's owner enough money so that they are more or less even, right? They don't lose too much. But we should not think, especially not next year, about supporting aggregate demand. It's useless. And that's, by the way, it's also useless what the ECB is doing right now, right? The ECB had to prevent a financial crisis, but to try to foster aggregate demand for everybody, doesn't make sense in this particular recession, which is very much sector specific, right? So that's the first point. Finance minister should not think, how can I foster demand? Because people, if you give them money, they will not spend it, or at least not spend it on the sectors which are weak: restaurants, tourism, travel, services. You provide replacement income, that's different. How much replacement income can you provide? Well, there's the question, how much debt can the country take? Right now, debt doesn't matter. But we have had 2 big crises in 10 years. Do you want your country to go into the next crisis with a debt level equal to 150% of GDP, or rather with 60% of GDP? That's the question finance ministers and prime ministers should ask themselves. Where do I want to be when the next crisis hits? Even if in the meantime the interest rates is close to 0, right? So apparently that is not a problem. So that is for me the second. Debt should be at the forefront of fiscal policy once the economy returns to normal. And we should really get our powder dry. We should reduce debt levels everywhere so that when the next crisis comes, we are prepared.
Thank you. Nico, you mentioned managing expectations. And it seems to me, judging from where the stock market is heading, where the interest rates are going very low, there is quite despite the gloom and doom of today, there is a kind of exuberance in those fields, and there is a promise of something positive happening after the spring. First, why is this happening? The stock market, the interest rates, etc. And what does this say about the future after the spring?
Let me start with a quick answer about perhaps what the market saw. The market saw two things. First of all, they're counting that once this is over, and the expectation is at the end of spring, then there's going to be a strong rebound in the global economy, which is not actually extremely unlikely. It's a more likely scenario. The second thing, however, is if you look more carefully, they are particularly, these markets and investors, they are expecting that it's going to be specific sectors of the economy, those that are more technology heavy, more digital, that those are going to jump very fast. So this crisis has functioned as an accelerator of things. And as you know, the market always discounts future profitability. So that's where we are. But I think it's actually useful to take the story a little bit from the start, because to relate also to some of the points that Daniel made, which have not, do not have a full answer yet as to where we're going in Europe. If you go, in my eyes, and we may disagree, the more the crisis to which we will be more allowed to compare the current one is probably the oil crisis going back in the second half of the 70s. So this is not necessarily, it has aspects in which this is different. However, this is not, and I'm going to agree with that, this is not a demand crisis. This is not an aggregate demand crisis. It's something that hits you directly, that directly challenges your ability to produce and your ability to consume. Okay, the second one is a little bit different. Now, at the end of the 70s and early 80s, most of the Western then economies actually accumulated a lot of public debt. And there were many ways in which this public debt eventually was managed. And then we got into at least 25 years of what we call the Great Moderation. In other words, many years of almost uninterrupted growth in the US, in Europe. Those were the good years. How did this happen? At the start, one thing that helped, it was a little bit of a lubricant, was a little bit of inflation. And that's something that's going to be very different in Europe the day after. And when I'm saying a little bit, I mean a little bit. But having an inflation of 2% makes a huge difference relative to having an inflation of 0 or even deflation. In terms of managing not only public debts, but also private debts. And it seems unlikely we're going to have that. And that is an issue because you cannot monetize part of your debt in that way. But of course, that was only the start. The main thing that drove growth in the 80s and then the 90s was computers and how those were put in the economy, and they drove productivity up. More trade globally, China, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, peace that we didn't have. Now, once we got in the years after 2000, we started accumulating a lot of debt. And Lehman Brothers actually showed this in a very strong way. Then we managed to cope with some of that in the US and in Europe. But in fact, a lot of the problems actually were hidden under the rug. In Europe, we got out of this not only with the program countries, Greece and Portugal, Spain to some aspect, but also Italy with a lot of public debt. And this public debt is still hanging like a big shadow on top of the economies. Certainly for Greece, even though the Greek public debt has this hybrid nature, it's not, most of it is bilateral and longer term. But that's a big question mark. And since you asked about expectations, for the moment, the reason why everybody appears able to borrow money at extremely low interest rates is because the expectation is that the Eurozone will appear very strong. That's also what is driving the euro up relative to pretty much every other currency. So we shouldn't worry about something catastrophic happening. Now, that is kind of the big picture, but this picture may change because politics may get in the way. And because if the pandemic runs for much longer, then in fact, these policies are going to come to an end. You cannot just print money forever. So that's kind of the big environment. For the Greek, and I'm going to stop with that, this answer. For the Greek economy, expectations are going to play a huge role. Public finances were put, the famous twin deficits, the fiscal deficit and then trade deficits were put in order. But now the trade deficit is worsening a little bit. That's all right, given the circumstances. But the public deficit is again here. It should be. If you don't spend at the time like now, when should you spend? But the question, what you're going to do with your fiscal budget from 2021 and 2022 is a huge question. How, in other words, you are going to preserve credibility of your finances, and at the same time not diminish growth. And the key there is that the country, Greece, should have primary surpluses that are positive, but they're mild. And at the same time, it restructures the way it collects taxes and the way it spends it spends this money. That's going to be not a trivial exercise, but I think we can be optimistic that if this is done, we can see a number of good years ahead for the Greek economy.
I'll come to the reform agenda in a sec, because it's very important to look at it. But let me turn now back to Daniel and pick up on something he mentioned about America compared to Europe. And I will try to inject the question of Southern Europe as well. Now, you kind of described what a person much wiser than myself long years ago talked about the creative destruction in America. That's how I took it, about the 30 million jobs lost, the 20 million new jobs created, subsidizing people rather than jobs, etc. So how would you compare the European with the American model? There was a lot of praise here in Greece about the German way of subsidizing employment rather than unemployment, and we kind of copied the German model here in Greece. And I wonder where you stand between the two, one. And two, we are having the European Council coming up soon under the German presidency on the 10th of December. How optimistic you are about the recovery fund? There are those vetoes from Poland and Hungary. And where do you see things going? And then I will ask you about Southern Europe, but let's have your take on those two first.
Let me answer on the recovery fund immediately. There are these objections by Poland and Hungary on the so-called rule of law mechanism. They have made a question of sovereignty dying with the national flag, right? If you look at the actual proposed legal text, it's a paper tiger. The actual proposed legal text, not the preamble of what parliamentarians say, what they have achieved, right? But if you look at the actual text, which is they are objecting to, it says that a country can be cut off EU funding if it has deficiencies in the rule of law, which threaten the financial interests of the European Union in a direct way. Right? And by the way, whether this is the case or not is subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. So the one side says, oh, we have found a way to punish Poland and Hungary, right? And the Poles and Hungary said, this is terrible. We have been put in a situation where just if the majority doesn't like our policies, we can be cut off from funding. Right? Both sides are totally off the mark. Now, the key thing is, can you find some declaration? Sorry?
Too much about nothing, I guess. This is what you mean.
This is something which actually exists to some extent before. It has become political symbolism. Right? Now, maybe somebody can find a declaration of the European Council which takes care of that. I don't know, but for me, it's not about substance. Right? So I'm out of this game, so to speak. Now, on this protecting jobs versus people and the famous Kurzarbeit.
But before that, so what do you mean? There will be a compromise in December in the council, or all this?
I think there might be a compromise. That's not a compromise, just some declaration of the European Council which states the obvious, right? Which states, but anyway, what is in there, right? And then the Poles can say, you see, we're right, we won, right? It might be actually not now, it might be a bit later, but I think that's the most likely way out.
Okay.
Right? But remember, it's not about substance. It's about form. On these short-term working schemes, they were used in Germany in 2008-9, when there was a short and sharp recession. It made sense. We have highly specialized enterprises who shouldn't lay off their specialized workers because they might need them again 1 year later, right? And it worked. It worked because for Germany, it was short recession. For other countries, it was not short, right? And there it doesn't make sense. So I think this has been completely oversold. It made sense in one particular circumstance for the industrial sector. It doesn't make sense now to apply it to the restaurant sector, where there are no or very few specialized workers which have specialized human capital specific to the specific restaurant they're working. So, and also it doesn't make sense to have it for 2 years. So yes, the short-term working schemes are useful at times. If you thought it's 6 months, then it's over. But they are also a way basically to impede progress, the creative destruction that you mentioned. Because enterprises will only get the money if they keep their workers. And the workers only get their money if they keep their job. And as I said earlier, yes, the economy will come back quickly, but we don't want it to come back to the situation we had before. We want a new economy.
So, Nico, how do you, given that statement and that evaluation and that opinion, how do you judge the performance of the Greek state vis-a-vis supporting the economy so far in the pandemic?
Well, there are three strong forces that actually shape the labor market in Greece now. And all three of them, they're troubling. One is that the areas where jobs were created primarily the last 20 or 30 years, they seem that they have run out of steam. And if we start counting, already one was housing, building, and construction, and this is already has diminished a lot from 2009 onwards. Then is public sector employment, and again this has diminished a lot. And then we have areas that were hit very badly from the pandemic, and this is tourism, this is restaurants, this is retail trade, this is transport, this is culture and entertainment, pretty much everything that relies a lot on human contact, on direct human contact. So we have a problem in that in the economy as it is right now, it has lost its ability to generate jobs. This is one. Then of course you can say, yes, but why don't we switch fast to manufacturing and high-tech firms and stuff like that? That's true. We should do this, and we should actually mobilize capital and labor in that direction. But part of the problem there is that a lot of jobs in those areas is actually being replaced by technology, in particular artificial intelligence system, digital this, digital that. So you could have a lot of production, but without having a lot of employment necessarily. And the third issue that we have is that in Greece, we still have a very significant part of the economy being in the gray zone, undeclared economy. This is related, although this is not one-to-one relation, with a lot of self-employment and employment in very, very small, tiny, I would say, firms. So what do you do in front of this? What the government policies are doing is what Daniel explained is also being done in most of Europe, which is we replace incomes to some extent, and we subsidize businesses as long as they don't fire people. And given where we are, I would agree that this is probably the best response up to this point. But looking forward, we cannot have this forever. We have to actually make businesses switch to where they would be more productive and make people switch to where they will work more productively. And this is going to require, of course, changes in education, especially vocational, in training programs where we are really lagging behind. But we have to start doing these things now. Active labor market policies when it comes to fighting unemployment. But also policies that are going to incorporate large parts of the population in the labor force. One of the secrets that people do not necessarily pay enough attention to is that in Greece, we do not only have high unemployment, but we have a more fundamental problem. We have a low labor force participation. We have a lot of people that for one reason or the other, they put themselves out of the job market. And this also has social consequences because this is not uniform across the population. This problem hits, of course, people of young age. People of young age in Greece, they are treated much, much worse than people of older age. It hurts primarily women that are treated by the labor market much worse than men, but also large and important special categories of the population, like people with handicaps. Our labor market is very bad in incorporating immigrants, and so on and so forth. So you have to do two things. And these things are going to sound contradictory, but they are only contradictory at the surface. We do need more flexibility in the labor markets, but at the same time, we need a much stronger role for the state to assure the welfare of people as they would be moving across businesses and across fields. And right now, we don't have flexibility, but we don't have a strong umbrella that the state provides to working people.
Mm. It reminds me of flexicurity or something the Scandinavians have perfected. Let me turn now to the reform agenda, which you have already introduced us to, Nikos. It seems to me, Daniel, that we are faced with a long-term, one might call it historic failure in Southern Europe. I mean, we have the two countries, Italy and Greece, that are the worst performing economies inside the EU for a long time. I cannot think of worse cases than us. And overall, the convergence of the South with the North has stalled a long time ago. One comes to despair, especially when compared with the economic success of some poor former East European countries like Estonia or even Poland, who have managed to climb up the ladder very fast the last 30 years. So I wonder, from a macro perspective, before we come to the specifics, what has been wrong with us here in the South? What should we do, and what Europe should do in order to reignite convergence?
Well, that's of course a $1 billion or $1 billion question. I would say that 95% it must happen at home. This is not something which Europe somehow can do. Europe can provide an environment in which you can grow quickly. And the Central Eastern Europeans were provided with an environment, a big market, capital which came to them, brought the technology and textbook convergence. In Southern Europe, I think Nikos already said it. I mean, the two key obstacles are basically the quality and quantity of education and the quality of governance. These are not things you can change by pushing a button and then tomorrow will be better. These are generational things. Just look at for Italy, I know the numbers. In Italy still has the lowest rate of university graduation in all of Europe, right? The average years of schooling is 1 or 2 years below the European average. And on top of that, the PISA study shows that the quality is on average low. It's pretty good in the north, but abysmal in the south, right? What do you expect, right? If technological change comes, your country can respond. And if you have a domestic governance which doesn't give people without political connections a chance, in Europe, they emigrate. They emigrate to the center. That's why you have brain drain. So what needs to be done is pretty clear. These two are the issues that have to be dealt with. They are not things which you push a button and you get results next year. You get results in 10 years. In education, 20 years. The Irish were one of the poorest countries in Europe. In the 50s, they made this choice as a society, not one government, right? That they could survive in this world, not on their potatoes, but by having a very high quality education for everybody. And it paid out a generation or two later. This is the way I would think about how Southern Europe could restart the convergence.
Nico, you participated in this Pissarides committee that has published a draft proposal of reforms that the government has taken over and has become part of the public debate recently. There is already some opposition. Can you sketch us out the basic proposals in a concise way? Obviously, our time is limited and we cannot go into the details, but if you were to prioritize, where would you give emphasis? What needs to be done in the post-COVID Greece?
Well, it's not, as Daniel was also saying, it's not a thing where you press a button or two and then things change as a miracle. An economy is indeed a set of rules that create incentives, and then these incentives lead to outcomes. Now, these outcomes, in turn, through the political process, may reinforce the system or not. Now, to be a little bit less philosophical about it, I think the key, speaking in a more technocratic voice, is that there has to be a systematic increase in two variables. One is productivity, the other is labor force participation. In the short run, this is easier to be done in some way, because we are so lagging behind. If we cover the investment gap, and this will not be terribly difficult to do to some extent, and we use in quotes the people who are currently unemployed, then this can lead, after the pandemic is done, to 2 or 3 years of reasonably good growth. But then what? Then the big force is going to be forces like the adverse demographic. The fact that people perhaps may choose to vote with their feet and rather than work here, go work somewhere in Northern Europe. The fact that there is going to be a self-selection of businesses, that if they want to be more extrovert, they will choose to be located elsewhere where the justice system actually delivers faster verdicts, and so on and so forth. This is the current trend. So how do you change that? First of all, you have to recognize that the current dynamic actually is going to lead us into problems. And you have to motivate, in my view, a social consensus and a political consensus around a path that I view as completely realistic. And in that sense, I'm actually quite happy that this report, which is an independent report, has generated a lot of public discussion. Now, where are things where you have to improve? Let's start with markets. Markets have to be more open. What does it mean, more open? A lot less rules. You put a line about things that you should not do, but pretty much everything else should be up to businesses and to people that want to innovate. This is how wealth is created. Then when it comes to the public sector, again, the central word has to be that it has to be very transparent, very, very simple, and very open. Can this be done? Technology actually helps, but it's up to politicians if they want to have a much simpler system like that. Of course, there are issues that have to do with the availability of capital, because without capital markets functioning, then you cannot have investment, and without investment, you cannot have jobs. However, once you create a strong dynamic, and let me, because I cannot replace here 240 pages of a report, but let me give you the central story. Once you make the system much more stable and open, and this can be done, it's a matter of rules, then you are going, rather than become alienating towards capital and labor, you are going to be attracting them. And that is going to be generating a self-fulfilling positive dynamic. okay, rather than having, this is going to be a positive circle. Is that enough to achieve convergence? According to our calculations, thinking about the next 10 years, this is not going to achieve full convergence, but from where we are right now, which is a little bit more than 65% of the EU income, we're going to come close to more than 80%. And that makes a huge difference, because it takes also off the table questions about whether the public debt is viable and so on and so forth. But then there is the question, okay, so in terms of how will it feel? How will the economy feel different from where it is today? What sort of things we will be doing? And there are two dynamic areas that I can spot. One area, and you're going to say, oh, but this is old news. No, this is important for Greece. It's everything that has to do with the tourism, with the climate, the geographical position, which is hugely important. We can be attracting people from everywhere, people to work, people to retire. We can really become the strong gateway when it comes to trade of goods to Europe. This is not to be minimized. This can make a huge difference, but you cannot do this without having a public administration that is solid, courts that are faster, and an education system that actually really educates people rather than producing degrees. If you make a couple of steps forward in those areas, then indeed Greece has a very strong local comparative advantage. So that's one. And the second thing is the whole nexus around technology. And that's something that that's kind of like a hidden treasure. Greeks have always been very open towards having more education. It's a very open and free society. People are curious and entrepreneurial. So once we actually release this potential, you can see growth of at least two types of companies. First of all, manufacturing companies that for European standards, they're going to have, they're going to be medium size, average, maybe 200, 300 people. So something like boutique manufacturing firms that are going to be very heavy on technology and servicing niches in the global demand. And we already have several of those. But rather than having 30 or 40 of those, we can have 300 of those. That's one. And the second is very small startups related to research when it comes to biotech, to software, to artificial intelligence applications. And we have several of those, but instead of having, 30 of those, again, we should have 300 of those. So combining these comparative advantages that are local with more technology, once you fix the institutional framework, as I mentioned, I believe that Greece can really be, especially starting from a low basis, a success story. But I put a lot of ifs before that.
Daniel, do you buy the story? Do you buy this mildly optimistic scenario?
I agree that Greece has a lot of potential upwards. I see it more as there's more potential in the elite than in the masses. I mean, the strong point about Germany and other Northern Europeans is that the bottom 70% of the population have a very solid base. The upper 10% are perhaps not world beating, but there's a very solid base. And I have the impression in Southern Europe, the education system is usually better for the upper 10%, the upper 15%, and the lower 50, they they are left lagging. But let me add perhaps one thing which I think Nikos also implicitly said, which is if you are a poor country on the periphery, policy mistakes have a very high price and good policy a very high return. So in Germany, even if the politicians make some mistake, that's right, the system is very strong, it sits in the middle of Europe, manufacturing base all around, so there's only so much damage you can do. Whereas in Greece, if you have the wrong policy, that spirals down, or as Nikos says, can also spiral up in terms of expectations. Not up without limits, right? But given the level at which Greece starts now with all the unused capacity, I think good policy could have a very positive impact and create a boom over at least 10 years. So I think that is what is important to keep in mind. If you are in the periphery, your policy can make a big impact.
And let me ask you something more as a politician. Nikos mentioned the need for consensus, and it still rings in my ears an advice by Anders Aslund, a preeminent economist, Swedish, you probably know him, Daniel, who has studied the economic transition of Eastern Europe and compared. And in his 10-point mantra he gives to would-be reformers, we had him in Thessaloniki in our symposium 2 years ago. He mentioned never care about consensus. When you have to reform, you have to go ahead, and the success of reform will create the consensus on its own rather than try to find peace with all the stakeholders, and the resistance is usually strong, etc. So I wonder, we talk a lot about consensus in Greece and try to find a consensus that have a very kind of a more deep-rooted agreement before we proceed. But at the end of the day, we have not proceeded. So I wonder, what is your take here before I turn to Nikos about the politics of reform?
I'm not a politician. I can give you one example from as they say, the country I know best, Germany. Everybody now knows Germany as the champion of Europe. 20 years ago, Germany was considered the sick man of Europe. And Germany had a building boom after unification, and then between 1995, for years and years, the economy was going down, slowing, high unemployment. Endless talk, we need to change, we need to become more competitive, and for years and years, nothing changed. Until not a consensus emerged, but basically enough people said, okay, now we have reached the bottom of the pit, we need to do something. Not everybody on board, but this was the famous Hartz reform, which took place in around 2003, 4, 5. Right? When Germany had a large deficit, a large unemployment. And then the social democratic government said, we have to change our labor market regulation. We have to make work pay. So basically, we ask people to accept low-paying job, and the government gives them something on top. Right? That was hugely contested by some people, but in the end, majority brought it forward, and then now comes the second point. Then Germany was lucky, also China came, lots of demand for German export goods, and things starting going better. And now that reform is more or less accepted. So you need to have a certain, not consensus, broad support, but you cannot carry everybody.
I wonder if SPD is equally happy with its future after the reform, but that's a different subject, I suppose.
The country is happy. You should think about the country.
I know, but politicians are not always that altruistic. Nico, what do you say about the politics?
Yes, and like Daniel, I'm not a politician either, but the politics are obviously central to the ability of a country to change. We are democracies after all. There is a way in which consensus is crucial, but there is a way in which consensus can be actually exactly what you don't want. And let me explain. First of all, what you don't want is that everybody sits around the table and puts forward protecting their own narrow interests, and then we have actually a stable agreement that we don't want to change nothing, and then we are happy with that. This is not the consensus we want. But what you want is a broad enough support. You want clarity. In other words, you start here, and where do you want to go? And that the point where you're going to go is actually going to be much better for a lot of people. It's important that when you implement change, you promise in a way that is credible to the majority of the people that they are going to be better off. Let me give you just a couple of examples that do not have to do with the macroeconomy or how you do with fiscal policy, but with the two areas that more directly affect the well-being of people. And these are the healthcare system and the education system, where if you actually bring up the question of modernizing and changing the structure in either healthcare or education right now in Greece, the reflexes that people are going to have, oh no, I don't want change. Partly, this is driven by vested interests that actually are so strong that they drive the public dialogue. Partly, this is very understandable because in the 10 years of the crisis and the 3 programs, rather than creating positive incentives, we always have sticks. So the Troika or whoever it was, they said, you have to do this or that, and if not, then I'm going to push you off the cliff. This is not the way to implement reform policies successfully. So people have this this Pavlovian reaction. They hear reform and they say, "Oh no," things. But that makes everybody very conservative in actually the worst sense of the word conservative. You know, you don't want to change. Exactly to connect with the first part of our discussion, exactly when the world is changing and you want to have change. So I believe that what is important is that in order to get support, first of all, you need to have a broader plan, but also a set of specific plans under the broader plan. That this is what I'm going to do when it comes to the hospitals, to the schools, to the courts. And you don't have to change everything at once, but you have to make clear steps and explain why, where you're going to go is going to be better. That's one thing. And the second thing is that you have to go for a lot of the low-hanging fruits first. In other words, you have to run reforms where people are going to say, oh, this works. Okay, so the politicians, they actually saw what happens elsewhere in Europe or in the world, and now we are better off. Mm. One last word on this, because we have been talking about convergence of the Greek economy to the rest of the Eurozone, which ultimately this is what we want. And I would more than agree with what Daniel was saying. What is important is not how much the country grows, but what type of jobs, social cohesion. We are doing terribly when it comes to social mobility. These are things that should worry us. But when we talk about convergence in terms of welfare with the rest of Europe, we can actually take a lot of shortcuts. we don't have to necessarily mimic all the mistakes that many of the European economies are doing. So if, for example, not to mention specific countries, if there is an economy that has lots and lots and lots of regulation, and there are such economies in Europe, we don't have to mimic that. In some sense, we have to use a bypass mechanism, and simplification is exactly the route forward for the Greek economy. You have to simplify the way the public administration works. You have to simplify rules for markets. And if you do that, this is going to unleash a huge potential.
Thank you, and create this momentum that will bring from the low-hanging fruits to the higher-hanging fruits, and so on and so forth. Now, we have had more than an hour of some serious talking and serious thinking and heavy lifting with issues of paramount importance. And I would like to thank you both for the extraordinary insights that you brought in the conversation. We can have 1 minute each, maybe Daniel, if you want, to conclude, commending, summarizing, wrapping up, looking forward as a farewell before we say goodbye to our audience.
Let me just say that the night always looks most dark just before dawn. So I think we see some, especially in Greece, some changes happening. And I'm quite optimistic, at least for the short run, that there should be a strong recovery now coming. And let's hope it's not just something which lasts for a year, but which puts Greece and also the rest of Europe on a different growth path.
Thank you. Nico?
Well, obviously, the first and obvious thing to say is that what we are going through right now is a lot more than an economic crisis. Human life and health comes first. We are not out of the woods yet. We have to be very careful, and we have to be very courageous. And I have two fears when it comes closer to economics. The first fear is that if we come closer to the summer and somehow it looks like the current path doesn't materialize, but instead the problem remains, then we may well see the conditions for a new financial crisis. That's one fear. The system will become less stable. The second fear is that if the problem actually continues, then we are going to see social reaction in Europe. That's what we care about most. And this may actually destabilize the political process that right now seems to be driving also the economic decisions. And this may lead to more populist solutions than like the ones we have been talking about. These are the fears. But I believe we have to be optimistic. After a year and a half of very deep crisis, it looks like things are going to be brighter. This is the most likely scenario. And I do hope that in this very strong wave that is going to be global, Greece is also going to not only join, but find the opportunity to become something that is a lot more open and hence a lot more productive and prosperous than before. There is a good chance.
Thank you, Nikos. Optimism comes natural to politicians. Nobody votes for a pessimist, right? When economists are optimistic, so much better. So let's say goodbye to our audience with that high note. Once again, thank you very much. I know you are very busy, overextended, in various committees and projects, but you make the time to be with us and share your thoughts with a wider audience, thanks to technology. Thank you, and hopefully we can welcome you to Thessaloniki live sometime in the future when your schedule permits and the recovery is bouncing up. Thank you, and to the audience, we will be back next Monday at 8:30 sharp, as usual, on a very interesting panel on Turkey with a prominent Turkish professor, Sully Özel, from Turkey, and an American analyst from Columbia University in New York, David Phillips, to talk about where Turkey is heading. Thank you very much and good night.